We were just talking right now before we started recording about this whole regulatory environment, and operators really need to be focusing and paying attention to what's coming up in the future. Could you just expand a little bit more on that?
We're in a climate emergency, and I do get the distinct feeling that the sector itself has a view that it really doesn't matter how much energy they use and how they use it and whether or not it's efficient and how much water use, because they think they're going to get a free pass from legislation. It's not going to happen. They are not going to get a free pass. They will be under a greater compliance burden as we move forward, and the legislation is in place at the moment, and there will be further pieces of legislation coming down the line which will focus their minds.
This is legislation built around a lot of sustainability, or is it other areas?
The data center industry per se has always been subject to regulation, but it's never been specifically targeted to us. It's more on electrical safety at work and perhaps some EU ETS, for instance, the emissions trading system, looking at your generation capacity on site. But that legislation was written primarily for every sector, and it's a compliance burden for us. But the new legislation specifically mentions data centers. I mean, back in 2020, the EU said data centers and telecommunications networks can and should be carbon neutral by 2030. And everybody focused on that. And there was panic, right? And it led to the creation of the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact in Europe. But I went into a little bit more detail of that Green Deal, and there's a jigsaw puzzle, and one of the pieces is scrutiny and legislation. So they were trying to do a self-regulatory initiative, basically policing yourself. It's clear that it's not going to be self-regulatory. It's going to be an external audit of those facilities to criteria that is already in play.
So you mentioned legislation. Are you talking about the US, globally, EU you mentioned as well?
In terms of data center concepts, the EU is probably 5 years ahead of the US and Asia Pac, including the legislative pieces. So the thing with the taxonomy regulations is that it doesn't matter where the data center is. If you are an investor, so a bank or an investment trust, and you are providing capital for a data center construction project, and you have European investors, there is no geographic limit. So we're working with a client at the moment, which is a UK-based investment trust, which has European investors, and they've invested in a data center in America, and that data center has to be audited for the compliance purposes.
When you say auditing, it's a very big, scary word. What exactly do they look for? Do they look for the PUE?
All of the European legislation is founded on the EU Code of Conduct for Data Centers, which I've been working on since its inception, basically 2010. We're on the 14th edition of that, but it's never been written for an auditable purpose. So last summer, as a result of a bit of left hand, right hand jiggery-pokery, FISMA, which is the DG financial arm, published the taxonomy regulations, which linked back to the Code of Conduct. And you had two options, basically. You had an independent audit every 3 years, either to the Code of Conduct itself or the standard, which is CLC Technical Report 5600-99-1. Neither of them are written in a compliance format. Instead of using words like shall and should, which is really mandatory and recommended, the words were consider and evaluate. Well, that's not good enough for audit purposes. So DG Connect, which is the Digital Infrastructure Commission body, commissioned the TIC Council, which is the global trade body for certifying bodies. So they look after people that are providing 9,000, 14,000, 50,000, etc., to look at the Code of Conduct and make it into an auditable standard. Because I work closely with the European Union Joint Research Centre, I review all of the Code of Conduct participant applications anyway. I was by default put onto that team, that drafting team, and I wrote probably 5 of the sections, changing the words from you shall consider to you will do that, and that was published at just beginning of March.
So it's really this year they need to be considering it?
There is a lot of movement because the first section needs to be reported by the 30th of June this year, and the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact have engaged with Bureau Veritas to provide the auditing services, and we're working with Bureau Veritas to assist them in that process. The second part of legislation, which I think is probably the sector behind, is that you've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So that focuses on actual end users, and it forces them to calculate their Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 and any other emission sources, not just on their own property, but any external services. So if they are looking at data center services co-location or they're using cloud, then they will need to contact the co-location service or the cloud service and say, how much energy am I using? And the problem is that the co-location guys and the cloud guys do not know.
They know the entire data center, but they don't know maybe individual clients?
They know individual clients in terms of their energy use. What they don't know is the proportion of the data center overhead that should be applied to each individual customer. That's something they're going to have to work on. There probably is the information available, but it's spread across different operating systems and management systems, and it's be a question of pulling them all together and then working it out. And I don't think even the algorithm for doing that has been sorted. But we've had some ideas, we've worked with a couple of clients, and we think we've got it in a situation where it's good enough to report. And of course, we'll refine and hone that as we move forward.
Do you see a place from AI tools or AI softwares to help support data centers in calculating these?
AI, I think, is a much overhyped thing at the moment. At the end of the day, you've got to ask the question of AI, and the AI has got to go and find the answer. And the loudest voices on that particular topic tend to be at the top of the AI results that come back, and they may not be the right answers.
You mentioned this 2030 time limit that was given, and Microsoft has also come out in the past saying they will be carbon neutral by 2030. Is it quite challenging for the industry to achieve these? Because I'm not seeing a lot of movement, actual action or investment from colos.
There's a number of challenges. First challenges is the embodied carbon used in the construction of the facility. So you've got, the usual steel superstructure, your foundation, your internal, external cladding. So that's one piece, the construction piece. Then you've got the mechanical electrical equipment inside it, so your cooling, the electrical systems. In order to calculate the embodied, so the construction side of things, there is already some really good information available. So we know how much a ton of a certain type of concrete will emit in terms of carbon. You can put that number and put it into a spreadsheet. We know how much a piece of steel is from a country and from a specific manufacturer, and we know how much that is. That's fine. Construction side of things, great. The electromechanical equipment though, we need what is known as an environmental product declaration. So what this is somebody will undertake and basically get a piece of kit in, completely dismantle it, and work out the percentages of each primary thing in it and get the numbers. And they can only go so far for the manufacturing processes that they have. Their problem arises is when they're buying in products from other suppliers who haven't done their EPD. So it cascades down all the way. So if I'm buying a control unit or a rubber seal or nuts and bolts and steel from somebody else, I have to go in and ask them for that information. And they might be buying in components from another company. So they then have to go and ask them. And so on and so on and so on until you get to the actual primary manufacturer of that particular component. And what we're finding is that they are usually small SME businesses that are producing literally, say, 100,000 bolts a day through a manufacturing process, and they're using so much energy, so it turns out it's minuscule numbers for a bolt and a nut, and then you have to look at it and multiply it up, and say it could be something like 0.001%, but you have to work it out. We've got 85% of the information. The remaining 15% is the one that's a bit more difficult to get. But as we move on, and the EPD studies are made for each product, even if you make changes to that product, you're not re-evaluating the whole thing. You only need to re-evaluate the changes you've made. And then that way, over time, we will have a very, very good source of information, which will make it very easy to calculate. At the moment, though, it's a bit Wild Westy. So we're working with the world's largest data center construction project. We're embedded client side, 493 megawatts of capacity. We're building up a body of information. We're automating a tool, but it's a specific tool which allows us to actually look at each individual element and create our own workflow. So this is not like a standard carbon modelling life cycle assessment tool. This is a bespoke tool, which once we've worked with our client on that, we'll have an excellent tool to go out into the marketplace and say, like, if you're building a data center in this location, you just need to give us your bill of materials and we'll be able to give you the number.
John, thank you so much for your time today, sharing your thoughts. It was very interesting to listen about the legislation and carbon. We haven't really had that from anyone that I've interviewed.